Hello, everybody. My name is Evgeny Kiselev. We are on my YouTube channel, and you see that I have an unusual guest today, Alexey Arestovich. I made a decision to continue talking to Alexey, and some people will probably not exactly like that with the recent pressure and stuff. But and you'll be probably okay to say that you don't like that speaker, and I'll be unsubscribing from that channel. So there's a definite change in mood of attitude to Alexei Arestovich, and we all have different questions, and we want to ask these questions. And if there is a chance to talk to a person, even if the society in Ukraine, and not only in Ukraine, the attitude is changing to that person, I think it's worth to discuss with Alexei to understand the motives that are driving this figure. Thank you, Alexei, for coming. I appreciate you not trying to duck my request and coming here to the stream. Because I'm sorry, but some of the things you've voiced recently, in that day that we're talking today, after that horrible missile attack that aggressive Russian military carried out today, and they launched over 150 targets on the territory of Ukraine. And there are some hits, there are destroyed facilities and destroyed objects, and some killed and wounded. So I think now there is probably even more pressure at you of misunderstanding, being misunderstood, and public have questions. Oh, you're awaiting my reaction from me, Evgeny? Yeah, I want to bring up the recent interview where you said that you are a proponent of some sort of unification between Ukraine and Russia, some new pact against the West, if you want. No, Evgeny, I'm scaring the West with these perspectives, because being here in the West, I know the discussions they carry, and I know what's the main group of arguments in these discussions. So for me, before we go, Alexei, so I don't so I don't quote you wrongly, are you really for having some peace between Russia and Ukraine, so they would do things jointly and bring up certain legal action against the West or other action? No, Evgeny. I'm for the alternative between the big war that would likely last, a series of wars up to 15 years, and another option when we all can sit down and think how to avoid these wars in Europe on the territory of Ukraine. Because personally, as the citizen of Ukraine, as an officer who gave an oath to defend this country, I would not like my country to be the battlefield for the next 10 to 15 years. I do not like how is it unfolding. I can see where is it going. So if there is a reasonable probability, in which I personally do not fully believe, but if there is a chance to do that, to sit down and figure out a way to replace the non-working Potsdam-Yalta security system, personally, I would say I'm a skeptic somewhat, because there likely will be quite a few series in the next 10 to 15 years, similar to Ukraine or Israel, and not only here in Ukraine, there'll be other places. But if we're talking about rationality, we need to bring some rational solutions to, and not just predict that the war will last till 2035 or 2042. All right. So in this case, how, in this current situation, when people again faced the terror act from Russia, and you're calling upon negotiations with Putin, right? How can you negotiate with a person who is a serial international military criminal? Well, we're not talking about negotiations between Ukraine and Russia. From my point of view, they will not lead to anything fruitful, and they are quite impossible. What we're talking about is that all the strong players of the world, China, Britain, United States, Europe, Ukraine, Russia, all those who are mentioned in the formula by Zelensky earlier, of the new security system, and those people who actually promised to be guarantors of security of Ukraine. And we know that Brits actually promised to participate in such format. We want them to get together at one table and discuss ways how to create a new security system. Potsdam Yalta conference worked till the 80s, and then when Yugoslavian war started, that kind of broke it apart. And we understand that Ukrainian war just put a big dot on the life of that system. And we understand that all the negotiations between Ukraine and Russia are forgone. After Istanbul attempt to negotiate, I don't think we'll ever see such a quality of negotiating offers from them. I'm sorry to interrupt you here, Alexei. Since you're bringing up those Istanbul agreements, tell us more about the nature of it. Yesterday, one of the participants, Alexander Chali, I think he was giving an interview in Geneva in Europe and some politologist diplomatic forum, had said that there were achieved certain agreements and we could have struck peace, but for unknown reason, this all fell through. So he also did not mention two things. What were the details and why did it fall through? So what was there? I will follow David Rahamia, what he already disclosed. Since he started disclosing some data, I guess I can elaborate more as a participant. So in logic of these negotiations, they initially set a very high framework. They said demilitarization, denazification, removal of certain government institutes, etc., and not joining NATO. And then after every military defeat, they were removing some of these requests. And in Istanbul, they, together with our group, finally settled on a certain set of terms. This agreement is not fully published yet, but we can say today that there was even a discussion about the status of Crimea, that in the next 10 to 15 years it can be a subject of negotiations. And in my point of view, as we look at the key points, I think it was a parade of unexpected gifts from Russian side, and understandably they suffered a serious defeat at that moment of war, and it was quite an analogy to the Chinese-Vietnam War back in the 70s. So when China stopped that war in 6 weeks, understanding that they cannot achieve the goals that they initially set out to achieve, and then they started redoing their inner military structures and societal works in China. So that was analogy to that, what was happening in Russia and with Russia and war at that time. And Istanbul meeting and the overall conclusions were still to be discussed at the end and formalized at the end, but the goal after which would be probably meeting with between Zelensky and Putin, after which they would announce a formal stop to the war, formal ceasefire, and then stop. Both sides were going towards withdrawal of troops in some territories, especially Russians withdrawing from the occupied territories to the state of 23rd of February 2022, and then the rest should have been discussed and negotiated. So those terms were pretty good. And I was also a participant of Normandy format, and I spent a couple years there, and I know what was demanded of us back then and what approach they practiced at those times. So de facto Istanbul agreements, they were covering all the drawbacks and all the problems that agreements Minsk I and Minsk II were carrying in themselves. And I can only say that I regret that those documents were not signed. But looking at what is unfolding now and the logic of these events, I think that one way or another, it would not have worked, probably, ultimately. So what actually served as the reason to not sign it back then? What interrupted? Nobody knows that. I suspect even Charlie doesn't know, and as he mentioned in his speech, when we returned from Istanbul, it was time to start raising champagne and basically saying that we figured a way to resolve this conflict. And we were glad that we resolved problems of Minsk One and Minsk Two as a person who was part of those negotiations, trying to pull them to the better condition. But yeah, I knew how treacherous the Minsk Two agreement was. So we were happy about what was going on with Istanbul. And then I went closer to the front line. Upon my return to Kiev, I was told that the group is not going together and there will not be any negotiations going forward. Since it was the Bucha time, it was understandable why the negotiations were paused. I think Lavrov mentioned that Russia was still open, Russian Minister of International Affairs mentioned that Russia was still open for negotiations, but Ukraine didn't come to the next round. So you think that those atrocities that were uncovered in Bucha, in Borodyanka, in suburbs of Kiev, where people saw horrible aftermath of occupational forces presence, do you think that was not enough of a factor to stop negotiations? Well, Evgeny, if you think about it rationally, after the initial Bucha, there happened a lot more Buchas, which would have been avoided if we struck peace. So it's a question of logic and history, and the logic of history doesn't always coincide with the logic of emotions. At least we could have brought negotiations to request military criminals, right, to be given to Ukraine. That could be also a subject of discussion. But now looking back, I think that those terms were probably doomed to not be signed because the logic of contradictions that were uncovered, it shows that the contradictions are much deeper, and 6-week war would not be able to resolve that level of contradiction. So the main tune of Kremlin basically is NATO at the border of 91, right? And Putin, by the way, changed a few things. In my view, I remember I mentioned that he made 4 decisions that are rather effective decisions. And one of them, he managed to turn this conflict between Ukraine and Russia into a global conflict between global South and global North or global West. And the global South too quickly jumped into signing this or siding with Putin in this conflict. That tells me that the fault line and the lines of tension lie deeper. And this is an issue with China and Taiwan, China and India, all those countries that are participating in BRICS who are buying Russian oil, a lot of countries that have their interests. And my position is that we need to resolve this conflict at the level of this sum of interests of different players. Unfortunately, I do not see the sides willing to set the question in that shape, in that fashion. So that means that the war will most likely continue unfortunately, in the same format. But at least for myself, I can say that I was the person who was trying to bring up that we need to sit down and figure out a new security system, that we need to sit down at the table and rewrite the security system, at least for Europe. And the fact that the probability for that was very small, I at least brought it in a public discourse, and I'll put that in my bio because I think it's a very important step, and I got a lot of hate as a result of that step. As for my suggestion to join Russia and set the collective bill to the United States, I'm here amidst the Western discussion, so I know what they're discussing here internally in think tanks, where they prepare expert opinions and all. So here is a typical title of Politico these days. What will happen if Ukraine loses the war? And they review different scenarios, including the one when the West may be facing a joint Ukrainian and Russian armies if Russia annexes the whole Ukraine and rebuilds the army with Ukrainian resources. So they calculate the growth of industrial potential, essentially rebuilding of Russian Empire, more powerful and more angry than it was before this war. So that's what they're using to scare themselves, because the threshold of American support to Ukraine is so low that they're using the strongest arguments to try to convince that this aid needs to be increased. And I'm giving the same arguments that they can take now. The other hand is that on the Russian language, Russian-speaking space, it may look very shocking, but I would say the situation is shocking as well. Because if we have to use these terms, these scary scarecrows to scare the West into helping Ukraine, that tells the situation is very dire, that it's not obvious that America will continue supporting Ukraine. The next discussion will start after January holidays, when Congress comes back. Even if they will come and vote, it's still going to be a long story, at least a month after mid-January. And we see what's happening in Ukraine right now when they're talking about full mobilization, when government figures are coming and saying that they will freeze payments to military, right? Military. Sorry to interrupt you here, Alexei. Do you think that on one hand, Marchenko and the other figures in Ukraine, they're trying to raise the bets in some sense, and they're scaring the West with their statements as well, hoping that in some fashion the West will provide promised aid and will do it quickly. And people on the West, politicians, politologists, and different commentators, they are trying to scare that word that you used, themselves and the voters to justify their own lack of decisiveness. Yes, Evgeny, that is the problem. Exactly, because that whole politics reached the point when you need to use the language of fear in the discussion between Ukraine and the West and within the West. This is by itself a sign of severe issue. And there is an old saying that the task of the intel officer is to scare the command so that they would start thinking and would start thinking of different scenarios where they can strengthen the weak points. Today or yesterday, Shmyhal, our prime minister, appealed to his colleagues to sit down to discuss extraordinary measures that need to be taken due to the situation with the economic and the budget outlook for the next month. So I have a question. When Shmyhal announces that extraordinary meeting, he's not a Russian spy, right? But when Arestovich is talking about the similar issues, I am a Russian spy. It's just that a lot of our viewers, unfortunately, are not aware of the discussion on the West. It's not me talking about Russia and Ukraine joining. It's what they're discussing in American Congress, in Europe, in Poland. And they're discussing this probability, this scenario, when without the Western aid, Ukraine can lose this war. American aid is very problematized. We can somewhat rely on Europe, but the degree of heat in the inner discussions in the United States that nobody can guarantee that the United States will actually continue supporting Ukraine with money or military aid. I'm here, I know, I'm listening to all that. Yes, but Alexei, do you understand the resources that the West has? That's an interesting story, Evgeny. Right, but let's take even a small Norway. I think they have 1.4 trillion euros of so-called national fund, or however they call it, the fund of future generations. And that fund is growing. They don't know what to do with this money, so they could probably use that money to support Ukraine. Right, as somebody who was in Norway, I was curious about these things. And I was looking into some of these issues. I know that those people who live in Norway can correct us, but they're now eager to be paying stipend to natural sciences specialists and those who study for that. So they are even paying several dozens of thousands of euro for you just to study, but they have very few candidates to even study that, right? So the problem of the West is that it has a very unhealthy situation internally. The fact that we had to switch to the mode of extraordinary communication with them, and as you noticed, it's not only Arestovich who is talking in these terms, it's also now highest military political leadership of Ukraine that is using the same language. And also our partners who are insisting on continuing aid to Ukraine, they're using even worse arguments than we are using, because they don't have any arguments left. The West otherwise doesn't want to wake up and participate in this story. Alexei, would you agree that on the West there is a certain scarecrow that is very often packaged in a solid scientific looking argument that Russia is too big to let it fall apart? That, yeah, right, too big to fall, exactly. So Putin's regime, as horrible as it is, we don't have any else, and we'll need to be talking with this one. I would always remind people of the, I would say, old school political philosophy, line of thought, the story about George Bush Sr., who made a statement on the 1st of August, 23 days before Ukraine was announced independent. In the High Council, it was called High Council back then, it wasn't called in Ukraine High Rada, in front of the deputies of the parliament that would announce that independence, with an appeal to not go independent. As sadly known in America, a speech by President Bush, named after the Kiev cutlet. Right, this story, Evgeny, is rather long. If we need to, we can create certain context for our listeners. Let's create that. So I did speak about that in my other interviews, but there was a guy named Cannon, an author of a long telegram in 1946, who considered to be an author of Cold War. He is an architect of the theory they used for the whole Cold War to hold Russia, and he calculated the motives and main players, and he was predicting main events stage by stage in the next decades of years to unfold. He, I think, lived to the early 2000s, and he is a great mind of a huge scale. So George Bush was initially in that tradition as well. And Americans that you talk to here, representatives of serious think tanks who work with foreign politics a lot, they're saying that George Bush was the last president who actually was competent on the foreign affairs, because now they're saying those people who are responsible for foreign affairs, they have seriously lowered the level of discussion and the plank overall. So Cannon was a categorical opponent to the West expansion to the East after 91, after Soviet Union collapse. All these discussions are open. You can find that in Google. Just Google Cannon against NATO expansion. And he was explaining that it would bring upon the war with Russia, which the West would lose. And Russia was far from being in a good shape at that time. It was crumbling, falling apart. Things were messy, but he was explaining why that would happen. And this was a person who held Soviet Union, or whose logic was lying in the basis of holding Soviet Union for the past 40, 50 years at that time, at that moment of history. And now people continuing that discussion in the West, they are appealing to his statements. They're saying that the United States and the West at large made a lot of mistakes, promising things that they shouldn't be promising, beckoning upon new countries to join them. And it's interesting to observe who is standing on this viewpoint and who is resisting that, who is in the opposition to it. So if to be in the context, you can see that they're appealing to a certain line and they're dancing with the arguments around that core spinal cord, right, core line that they're walking around. So that's the line they're appealing to. I wasn't quite understanding that message until I got here to the West and started researching what and how and why, what arguments are they using. But one way or another, they're dancing around Cannon's theory. And they cannot find new arguments, basically. So what's happening in the West, namely in the United States, they're not reviewing the question of aid to Ukraine. This is more of a contextual element. They're reviewing the overall politics starting 1991. That's the level of discussion. And you can see how it spills through some of the statements. Remember, Bill Clinton about a year ago said that it was my big mistake to disarm Ukraine, nuclear arms, to remove them from Ukraine. And that's one of those bubbles of the discussion that is going under the behind closed doors here in the West. And yeah, they're discussing also that they did not provide enough aid to Russia, which they needed at that time, right? The Russian Marshall Plan, so to say, in the 90s. Right, there was a discussion too. There was also a discussion in the early 2000s about Russia maybe joining NATO, right? So they've went through all the different options and they're reviewing all that history. But now the fact is that the missiles that we gave as a country to Russia when we were disarming X555, they're the ones, and X101 are the ones falling in our heads, being lobbed by Russia onto Ukraine. So there is also another side, the problem of help, which I did talk about before, but we can repeat that again. American geopolitical model, American geopolitical school, is Moscow-centric, is very Moscow-centric. Some in that Moscow centricity reach the Moscow philiac level, and it's such a feeling when you talk to these people. You know, an interesting paradox is that they're not really hiding it. You can find this discussion in the media, in the internet. Very few people research that, but it exists. And they're saying rather blatantly there that the existence of independent Ukraine is a problem in building right relations with Moscow, as they're saying. And I heard that for 2 years in our trilateral Normandy negotiations group. Our respectable German and French partners, you could see how, I'll just be blunt here, how we are a hurdle for them just by even bringing that problem to the table. They know we could see that they wanted to deal with Moscow in a certain fashion. There is a logic of how to deal with Moscow for hundreds of years, and Ukraine is breaking that line. All right, to not quarrel with Moscow, to engage them, to bring into different projects, and they will civilize and all that, and don't care about what's happening inside Russia internally. Let them even eat their own kids at the barbecue. The main thing is that they would not threaten our national security on the West, right? So Kissinger and his people. Exactly. Unfortunately, it is so. And remember Liz Truss in May of 22? She was prime for a very short time frame, but then he made a statement which I analyzed. I think you and I mentioned it too. She said a wonderful thing. She said that after 1991, we decided that geoeconomy will prevail over geopolitics. We gave Iran, China, and Russia access to technologies. We gave them packages of economic aid and markets, and we were hoping that economic inclusion will allow their businesses to win and economic interests to win and change their geopolitics. But it turned out that everything that we gave them, they are using and were using against us. So look, this is a society where geopolitics is still prevailing over geoeconomy. The majority of people here seriously think that serious projects, starting with joint climate regulation accords and finishing with joint projects in security areas about Africa and other countries, other territories, they can be used as instruments to hold Russia and hold those problematic countries. After 2 years of this war, they still of that opinion. This is almost religion to them. This is when arguments are not really listened to, or listened to very reluctantly, and they're standing on that rather firmly, because that's part of their paradigm. And in order for the West to change and start doing what Ukraine-Russian opposition is wanting them to do, they need to go through such a transformation that I don't even know when the last time they went through something like that. Maybe when Ronald Reagan came to power in the United States? Yeah, exactly. The level of Ronald Reagan, we need that figure. Somebody who said, essentially, why are we conducting that de-escalation politics with Soviet Union? Because Henry Kissinger was a fan of that politics, and what do we have now? We have invasion of Soviet Union into Afghanistan. we are seeing a threat to such invasion into Poland. How about we declare a war to Soviet Union and win in that? And he called them the Empire of Evil. He called communism a dead end in the human development. And very soon we will send it to the archives of the past. And he won, together with Thatcher, right? Unfortunately, Evgeny, we do not have the figures of that caliber. Thatcher or Reagan are no more to be seen in the politics. And we even have an analogy to Falkland Islands. Now we have Venezuela declaring annexation, and it doesn't matter if it's armed or peaceful. And what is Britain doing about it? They're making some steps on the diplomatic level and maybe security, but compared to the decisive answer by Margaret Thatcher in regards to Falkland, this is just a pale shadow of the old West and the old politics of the West. And the catastrophe, it goes from the worldview, from the viewpoint on the world. For me, two or three stories became the key points, indicating that. First, they failed to indicate, the one I want to bring up is that they failed to launch the microchip factory in Arizona. Taiwan is under threat, so the United States decided to move the production, invested 40 billion into that factory. The factory is barely functioning. They cannot restart that production in Phoenix, Arizona. Why exactly? Well, they're saying the main data that I heard is that they don't have local specialists who are training people locally who are eager to go into the factory and produce. And if they are ready to go and produce in that factory, they start asking for certain conditions which cannot be met at this point. Because working on the defense contract or on the level of microchip factory, you have to write certain agreements and agree to certain features. But they cannot find enough labor force ready and agree. They try to bring Taiwanese, they try to bring other people, still not working, haven't figured it out yet. Then the second story was the second milestone. Remember those 40 or 50, 70,000 shells, which they initially gave to Ukraine and then returned back to Israel, and then we're trying to get it back to Ukraine. So 50 or 70,000 shells, that's something to be used over a week in the war of Ukraine size. That's a vanishingly small amount. So when they started pulling them back and forth, that's another milestone that rang the bell. The third one is over 70 components in Russian Kinzhal missile, the Dagger, the ultrasonic missile they used on Ukraine and continue using. 70 parts are manufactured in the United States. And what I'm seeing, my suspicions being confirmed by American analysts, is that the West failed to restart its military production. They seriously tried to do that after the first Rammstein, but they failed. We understand why, we understand the reasons, we named them, because it's difficult to put people in the night shift. It implies a difficult relation with unions and increase in the cost of production, because you'll need to compensate for extra time, and then your shells will cost their weight in gold, and they're not ready to do that. Or they're facing more difficulties. Yesterday's story, for example, one of the biggest German corporations that produces explosives, Union published that, is facing pressure from local powers, local authorities, who want to change some of the layout of the city around the factory. And German generals in Bundeswehr were opposing that, saying that we indeed are facing a big risk from Russia, so we need to expand the production. In the meantime, municipality where the production is located, they're disagreeing that the factory is taking too much space in the city footprint, and they need to use nearby areas for bicycling and walkways, and they essentially want to limit the space where the explosives are manufactured. So, indeed, I can confirm that, Alexei, that very often efforts to increase production, to increase the speed of moving the containers, going to Poland, going to Ukraine, I've seen that local bureaucrats in Germany very often run into some issues that, oh, it's 6 p.m. on Friday, short day, maybe even 3 p.m. on Friday. Come next week, basically. We're not going to expedite anything today. It's the weekend time. And there is nothing that can be done with this. Indeed, Evgeny, they are still failing to coordinate the way the troops are moved on their territories in Europe, because every municipality can forbid for the troops to move through. You basically, as a military force, need to ask individual municipalities. They try to take certain measures to remedy that, but still, you end up in many places in Europe where you have to ask locals to get permission to move the troops or armaments around it. And of course, the fact that Germany took 6 months to restart the production of artillery shells for their own tanks, not for somebody else's tanks, but for their own tanks. Right, Ukraine is actually building 155 millimeter shells in small quantities, but we still are making them now to produce them for the Western systems. And for them, it's their native caliber, and they're still failing to do it quickly. So, me being here in the West, I start using very strong metaphors, describing the West coming with their pants down to this war. Because when you listen to all these debacles, even my usually calm nerves give in. You can see that the West is mentally not ready, not even physically, mentally not ready for this war. And in order for them to be ready for the future conflict, they need to change their system of worldview. So essentially, take responsibility for everything they've done since 1991 and change the type of the social economic development of a social contract that they have, because otherwise they will not be able to relaunch their military industry. Billions of industries investments only lead to increase of the cost of shares, and their manufacturing is subservient to the financial factors and KPIs rather than production KPIs. And the problem is that the whole government with its welfares and social payments is also based on the system. So in order to change that, in order to change the effect of financial capital influence, which kind of won basically 100 years ago, early in the 20th century, you need to change the system. And the problem is that they lack leadership. They don't have new Reagans, new Thatchers. Very serious people like Kurt Walker are ringing the bells or tolling the bells. I did talk to him. I shouldn't be hiding that anymore, right? We were acquainted, we talked. But he acknowledges that there are very few of us who understands the situation, the criticality of it. We're fighting, but there are very few. And our main aid, United States, is in a very big disarray at the moment. And the worst thing I notice here is not that they prefer the wall between states and Mexico is a bigger threat, is a bigger importance than the war in Ukraine. Right? One can think that Mexico migrants are more important than the actual hot war in Europe. So, not the possible escalation in Europe that will require Americans to send more of their troops to Europe, but the wall with Mexico, right? Yeah, indeed. 12,000 Mexicans are coming to the country daily, and it is a serious threat as considered to their national security. And what's happening in Harvard and other universities as well. And the conflict of Russia and Ukraine, or the global South versus global West, these are on the second tier list of problems. And if to be blunt here, right, if I'm trying to really simplify this work, in their fight between Republicans and Democrats, or better describe isolationists and globalists, they fail to notice that their main political opponents start to use them for their own game. So Beijing representatives, Moscow representatives, they all pursue their interests. And unfortunately, those globalists and isolationists, they start to band together with those who normally would be their enemies, just to achieve the victory of their opponent within the United States. So they're losing the ability to be more selective in the resources that they pick for the fight. And you very often hear the vocabulary of a crusade. And that movie that's supposed to come out in April, The Civil War, as I was told here, the movie was shot by people who are pretty close to globalists. They actually funded or aided this movie, the shooting of this movie. So they're trying to fearmonger the conservatives, the isolationists, that if Trump comes to power, there'll be likely a civil war. But looking at what's happening in the United States, it might be, and I'm knocking on wood here, self-fulfilling prophecy. Because Americans are saying here that we've seen more scary things. When Kennedy was shot, America went outside and was fighting with each other, right? There were a lot of conflicts. But even they are saying that they have concerns about what will happen this year. And this is the time when Putin increases his pressure. And not just Putin himself, he actually created a coalition of him and the Global South. So Global South actualized itself. They created a second conflict in Israel. United States is already crumbling between these two hotspots. And in United States, they've tied the packages together, Israel and Ukraine. It's the same package to be voted. So they already see that aid as a joint issue. But what if there's going to be a third conflict? Where? Anywhere, any place. Taiwan, for example, Burma, Myanmar, or nearby, or Finland, Lithuania, Poland, or Western Balkans, or Iran. Where shall we take ammo, artillery shells, troops, and perhaps a spirit to deal with all that? That's a question in America. So in America, actually, it's an open data that their military bases were hit about 100+ times in the last month by Iran-sponsored forces in Iraq. They just don't want to interfere, so they're just weathering it. They're not fighting back. This has been unseen for, that one could shoot at Americans without being punished in return, without any retaliation. And when you pose the question asking why, and you get an answer that, well, the bloody experience of Iraq and Afghanistan, 20 years of fighting without any reason, starting a third war, we're not ready to do that. All right, Alexei. Let's start this way. Let's put a semicolon here and state that we're discussing new issues as they unfold. Right now, we still do not have a third front. New war has not started. Let's probably hope that these things will not happen and there'll be more positive scenarios that will be realized in this new year. We are recording this stream on the New Year's Eve. Let's add a little bit optimism here. Thank you very much for this conversation. I hope it is not last. And I will continue appealing to my viewers, to my audience, regardless of your opinion about Alexei Arestovich, regardless of how many sins you have accused him in. I think it's still interesting to discuss and to hear his arguments. I think he deserves to be heard. So please be tolerable and tolerant. And if you'd indeed like that stream, do not forget to click the like button. And yes, let's wish everybody the end of war and peaceful skies. Till next meeting.